Dr. Nageswaran is the 18th Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Before being appointed CEA, he was a writer, author, teacher, and a consultant. He wrote a weekly column in Mint on Tuesdays from 2007 until 2022. He has co-authored books on derivatives, global finance, and the Indian economy. He earned his doctoral degree from the University of Massachusetts back in 1994 for his work on exchange rate behavior. In 1985, he received a postgraduate diploma in management from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He worked in macroeconomic and financial markets research for international financial institutions in Switzerland and Singapore from 1994 to 2011, and now he's playing a critical role in nation building. So without further ado, let me hand it over. Doctor, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for those very kind words and generous words of introduction. I hope you all can see me and hear me well. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with the members of the Institute of Directors. It's an important issue that we face today in this country in the context of what is going on in the Persian Gulf at the moment, which is unfortunately, as many of us feared, doesn't seem to have a clear game plan or end game at this moment. But the longer the impasse continues and the Strait of Hormuz remains restricted, whether it is fully restricted or partially restricted, the fact that it is restricted not only affects energy trade, but also overall trade in general, keeps the cost of trade higher through free insurance, keeps the Gulf economies uncertain and therefore experiencing lower growth, which means it has an impact on India's remittances. And therefore, this has come about as a more significant, at some levels, more significant shock, or as significant a shock as COVID pandemic, but even more so in some other respects. Obviously, the growth shock of COVID was much, much bigger. This time, the growth shock of this particular West Asian conflict is that big compared to COVID. I mean, it is significant. I mean, it's sort of growing at between 7 and 7.4%, as we said on the 27th of February. I was standing along with the Secretary Ministry of Statistics in the media that we will grow between 7 and 7.4% in FY27, but then now it feels it will be somewhere in the region of between 6.1 and 6.8%, depending on how soon the conflict ends and how soon things become normal over the Strait of Hormuz, etc. But in the meantime, we also have received feedback about the monsoon and the effect of El Nino, and some people talk about super El Nino effect and so on. So I think the growth impact will be significant, but not as significant as COVID times. India, of course, otherwise has a very stellar set of macroeconomic fundamentals. I think it's important not to lose sight of it also, because it is easier to extrapolate all the pessimism in one direction and pull oneself back into the shell. That is not the right thing to do, because, as I said, on February 27th, we were looking at the situation and confidently projecting another year of 7+% GDP growth in India. Such GDP performance of over 7% has come about in a period of declining inflation, in a period of fiscal consolidation, in a period where India's long-term 10-year borrowing cost of the government of India was becoming lower and lower, and the spread to the US Treasury was becoming tighter. And this came at a time when India's sovereign credit rating got 3 upgrades last year from the USA, 2 agencies from the US and 1 from Japan. So we were looking ahead to the financial year 26-27 with a quiet confidence and expectations of steady 7+% growth, with very few macroeconomic imbalances that in the past have characterized India's growth. This time, the banking system is in good health. Credit growth is strong as well. So we were ticking all the macro health checklist boxes on February 27th. February 28th is when the conflict began in the Indian time zone, and therefore everything changed. What is it that boardrooms can do? I think it's important to, obviously, everybody has their own dharma or duty to their own companies. And therefore, whether duty to the companies doesn't necessarily mean duty only to shareholders, which might have been Milton Friedman's formulation. But we all know that in reality, it's all about choosing the right horizon for optimization. If you want to optimize long-term returns for shareholders, it's equally important to take into account the interest of other stakeholders in the company as well. And when I mean other stakeholders, everybody will then look to the balance between labor and capital. And I think the previous speaker was speaking about AI governance standards, etc. in India. I think when it comes to the implementation and adoption of AI, it's very clear that all countries face a similar situation. There is a lot of unknown unknowns. But with respect to India, the clear challenge is, of course, in terms of numbers. Because when it came to formal sector employment in the last 20, 30 years in India, it has been mainly IT sector. Other sectors followed after that. So that is definitely going to face a certain disruption or upheaval, as one might say. And companies, out of competitive pressure, out of bottom line pressure, etc., will tend to do the same thing as everybody else does, because there is safety in numbers. There is safety in being part of the crowd. But as it turned out in the case of radiologists who were projected to lose their jobs in the 2017-18, but subsequently in the last 7-8 years, the number of radiologists have only increased and the salaries have gone up. I think companies will realize that the artificial intelligence can only be deployed up to a point, and human interface remains critical as tasks become multitudinous and also unstructured. And also there has to be a human face in terms of accountability, and because you cannot hold artificial intelligence responsible for outcomes. So given all of this, companies may realize later rather than sooner the need for human presence. And the second thing people say is that, yes, of course, we will need human presence, but we will use it for medium to senior management jobs. But then the paradox is you cannot get to mid-level or senior management roles unless you have started from somewhere. So one doesn't very usually parachute themselves into the mid-level or senior level jobs. And if all companies were to do that, you can't even take them from other companies. So in other words, there could be a collective action problem here where everybody does something which they appear rational from the narrow point of view, but collectively causes damage to the ecosystem of the country, both social and economic. And that is something, it is not as if it's a problem of trade-off between interest of capital and interest of labor. It is actually a trade-off between short run and the long run. The moment we are able to widen or lengthen our horizon, the trade-off disappears. That is one message I wanted to leave with you. So for that, we need to think very hard, and if it is necessary, even collectively take a call across corporate boardrooms what we are going to do, because every problem that the world faces is magnified in the case of India, given the numbers. And if there is no social stability because of decisions we take based on narrow considerations, then all of us will collectively suffer, and therefore corporate prospects will also get impacted, ultimately undoing the effects of the short-run optimization we may be doing in the process. The second point I want to leave with you is that in the next 20 years, given that the world is going to be fragmented and conflict-prone, we all know that whether or not quantitative measures of globalization show that global trade is expanding and global value chains and supply chains remain intact, the truth is, world is becoming more inward-looking and self-centered. Last week, China, for example, unveiled some 17 to 18 rules, which made it more difficult for foreign companies as well, not just Chinese companies, to relocate their supply chains out of China, even into third countries or to their home country itself. This is absolutely unprecedented. So I think what is going to happen is that companies, even from their procurement point of view or sourcing point of view, has to think medium to long term. And immediate invoice price cannot be the only basis on which you choose to make your purchases from. Because the threat of disruption, the prospect of disruption, the prospect of weaponization of supply chains by some countries has to be taken into consideration as a relevant input in your input sourcing decision. When you take the threat of disruption into consideration, then the cost-benefit calculus will change. And therefore, it is possible for you to put a different perspective on some other sources which are available, which may appear costly superficially, but without the threat of disruption, their cost disadvantage will disappear, in fact. In other words, you have to diversify your sources of inputs. It cannot be only on the basis of the invoice price or the quotation price, which is a very inadequate indicator of supply chain reliability in the years to come. And fourthly, and the third dimension, therefore, that leads from this is not only one has to diversify one's sources, but also one has to invest in indigenization. And indigenization requires a higher degree of urgency today than before. But we have done this, we have been through this before, indigenization in India, but we have done it in an inefficient way because we are always tempted by a large domestic market, which can absorb whatever we produce. But we need to therefore do it in a manner that is cost efficient so that we should always keep one eye on global competitiveness. India, given its size, is punching below its weight. Therefore, in order to achieve strategic leverage, indigenization combined with competitiveness is what matters. And there again, I think boards have to play a very important role in convincing corporate managements of the significance and the importance of investing in R&D and not treat it as an expenditure, but as an investment. And without competitiveness globally, India will not achieve strategic leverage and indigenization will falter. And that again, the failure of these goals from a national geostrategic perspective will have its own adverse implications for corporate goals as well. So there is no distinction between these two. There is no trade-off between these two. Both have to be looked at together. In other words, national interest is suffusing with corporate interests in the next 25 years more than they did in the last 25, 30 years in the Indian context. And the last point I would leave with you is, along with the investment in R&D and the suffusion of national interest with corporate interest, is to ensure that whatever we do with respect to energy transition, etc., we need to also think in terms of buffers. Whether it is done at the national level or the corporate level, India has to have an inventory of key critical inputs, ingredients, and raw materials, and not just crude oil or natural gas. It could be even basic metals like copper, aluminium, nickel, tin, lead, etc. We need to build strategic buffers. We need to think in terms of creating national storage in many areas, because in the next 20, 30 years, the world will be going through more convulsions before a new order emerges. We are in the interim period between two orders. One order is now disappearing, post-World War II order, and there could be a new one which may come after some other cataclysmic or a climatic event. And we have to prepare ourselves leading up to the climatic event, which means you have to invest in strategic buffers as well. So I wanted to therefore leave you with these key considerations, not only in the context of the ongoing West Asia conflict, but also use this as an important occasion or a trigger or a catalyst to think about the medium to long-term considerations, wherein corporate interests do not necessarily clash with national interest, or short-term objectives do not necessarily clash with medium to long-term objectives. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me to share my thoughts with you.
Dr. Nageswaran, thank you so much for those insightful thoughts and the key deliverables where the boards have to evaluate their priorities for longer term, medium term, align it with national interests and not necessarily compete with it and look at it differently. Very pertinent thought, because I think that's been the problem that everybody has been talking about, that animal spirit in the private capex is missing. And that's something that you're alluding to, the fact that perhaps it's time to look at the national interest in conjunction with the shareholder value, which is the traditional form of looking at returns. So that's something that we'll definitely take away. But there are some questions coming in from the audience, so I'll just take the opportunity to ask one. I'm not sure if it's the best fit, but the question is, which sectors or strategic plays are most likely to benefit disproportionately from geopolitical fragmentation? So I'm not sure if you're going to take the sector-specific question, but I think what you talked about, the energy security and strategic reserves that we need to build up, is one important area I would.
No, I mean, look, I'm not wearing the hat of a capital market strategist in an investment bank at the moment for me to be able to give you sector-specific answers. And I think for a large country like India, uh, every sector will become nationally strategic. And I'm not trying to be very, superficially giving you a superficially convenient answer. I'll exemplify it with a observation about the agriculture sector. You may think that that is not strategic sector, but it is strategic. In the context of climate change and global food security issues, particularly even this year, given the likely impact on the fertilizer availability globally, I think even agriculture sector, investing in food processing, investing in productivity, will give India a strategic leverage it is lacking today, or as I said, punching below its weight, because other countries will suffer even more so than India will from global climate change and fertilizer shortages, etc. So even farming sector or all activities related to farming could itself be strategic. That is why I think, and if you take, for example, AI and the impact on labor markets, therefore investing in complete trade skills or care economy is strategic, because it is going to take care of your employment challenges. And to the extent that we take care of the employment challenge through AI insulated jobs, then you are doing something strategic, because without social stability, there is going to be no strategy. So there is no question of choosing specific sectors here. I think given the Indian size, all sectors will have a strategic role, because neglecting them can create strategic disadvantage. Back to you.
Fair. Just one more question, and this is from my end, and I'm trying to club two because I'm trying to get the maximum out of the time I have with you. One, we are living in a truly VUCA world, and with the number of complexities, I mean, how do you define what is structural and what is fundamental? Because, structural versus transient, because there's just so much happening, and what do you focus on and not? So that's my first question to you. And the other one I wanted to understand from you, you said diversify your supply chains. Yes, sure. But which are the regions which you think are the safest? Because whatever you pick, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Europe, whether it's China or now West Asia, everything is under some or the other kind of question. So which area is the safest?
So the first question is with respect to strategic versus transient. In fact, a series of transient shocks will become a structural shock. And I think that is the phase we are in at the moment. I think things are cascading from political to finance, finance to political, and from strategic to economic, and so on. The same thing with respect to horizons as well. Transient shocks will have a tendency to perpetuate themselves. This West Asia conflict, for example, could be considered transient, but could equally be considered structural as well. So I think transient and structural should not be viewed purely from the perspective of time horizon, but from the point of view of the significance of the shocks they impose, or the significance of the change that they demand of us in terms of our behavior and thinking. Whether it is transient or structural, therefore, becomes less relevant compared to what kind of mindset shift that they impose on us, or the challenge that it poses to us, so that we have to rise to it. I think that's the way to evaluate the nature of a shock, rather than from the point of view of its relevance of its horizon. And your second question was, just remind me.
The diversification, which area is safest, because there's something wrong with every place.
No, I think, no, not really. Not really. I agree that the choice set is becoming relatively constricted. No problems, no problems in agreeing with you on that one. But for example, there are lots of technologies available. Take shipbuilding for an example, or even the huge cranes that are deployed in shipyards. You could source from our northeastern neighbor, or you could source from further far east. So the question is, therefore, what choices do you make? So there are opportunities, there are alternatives available, not in all areas, because China has done a fabulous job of making itself indispensable in several areas. That you have no choice, then you have to decide whether you will be able to do it yourself in particular time horizon, and even to be able to produce it yourself, you may need technologies from them. Like, for example, in the case of batteries, where they denied it to one of the Indian large conglomerates recently, we read about it. So I understand that it's not possible in all areas, but we have to try in those areas where it is possible, because Germany does still have engineering capabilities. And France has nuclear energy. So does Switzerland. Sweden and is also equally has a niche in manufacturing, even for consumer durables. You don't have to rely on one source. And when it comes to medium to heavy tech, there are multiple areas in which Japan and Korea. This is important for you not to become indigenized, not to become self-sufficient and indigenized from A to Z. You have to become strategically indispensable in a few areas, which you can then use as a leverage. So for that, there are alternatives available.
Okay, would have loved to pick your brains more around it, but I know I'm conscious of your schedule. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us today. Really appreciate your thoughts.
Wish all of you all the very best for 2026 and beyond.
Thank you so much. From the Institute of appreciate your time.